In the winter of 1887, when the air turned cold enough to snap a horse's leg like glass, the people of Ridgefield were stepping over frozen livestock in their own barns, but 9 feet beneath an old woodshed, a 33-year-old widow sat in her shirt sleeves, reading a book to her children. Outside, across the open Dakota prairie, the wind was screaming out of the northwest at 50 miles an hour. The temperature had plunged to 42 degrees below zero, and the wind chill made the air feel closer to 70 below. It was the kind of cold that did not merely make a person shiver. It entered the chest like a draw of crushed glass and froze the moisture inside human lungs until breath felt like fire. Gunnar Thorne was a tough man who had spent 15 years on the frontier, but as he stumbled through the whiteout toward the Berggren claim, he was convinced he was marching toward a funeral. The snow was drifting in 6-foot waves across the flat land, obscuring fence posts and turning the prairie into a featureless sea of white. His own cabin, a sturdy log structure built 4 years prior, had failed him 3 hours ago when the stove flue cracked under thermal stress, filling his home with blinding, toxic smoke. His wife and children were huddled in his barn under horse blankets, freezing to death by degrees. His only hope was to reach the widow Freja Berggren, borrow what dry timber she might have left, and pray he could patch his chimney before nightfall. When Gunnar finally reached Freja's homestead, his heart sank. The small sod house her late husband had built sat dark, silent, and abandoned. Snow had drifted halfway up the south window. The door swung loosely on a broken iron latch, banging against the frame with every gust of wind. Inside, the hearth was cold. The water bucket was a solid block of ice, and frost coated the interior walls like white fur. It looked like a tomb. Gunnar turned back into the roaring storm, his hands already losing sensation inside his thick leather mittens. He was about to give up when his foot caught on something taut beneath the snow. It was a thick hemp rope, tied securely to the iron ring of the sod house doorframe and stretching 30 feet through the whiteout toward the old dilapidated woodshed built against the north rise. He dragged himself along the line, blinded by the blowing ice. The woodshed was a crude lean-to structure made of rough-cut cottonwood planks and tar paper. It was the kind of shelter most farmers used only to stack cordwood out of the rain. Gunnar shoved the heavy wooden door open, stepped inside out of the screaming wind, and collapsed onto his knees in the dark. The shed was stacked high, with split ash and oak. But as Gunnar caught his breath, he noticed something strange. The air inside the shed smelled of turned earth and warm pine, and near the far back corner, where the largest wood stacks were usually piled, there was a gap in the dirt floor. A section of floorboards, disguised under a thin layer of soil and wood chips, had been pulled back. A heavy 2x6 timber trapdoor sat open on leather hinges. Gunnar crawled over to the opening and looked down. A vertical ladder made of peeled saplings led into a dark, square shaft. As he leaned over the opening, a physical wave of warm air hit his frostbitten face. It was not just less cold than the storm outside, it was genuinely, wonderfully warm. He could hear the soft, steady murmur of young voices reading aloud, accompanied by the gentle cluck of a laying hen. He called out, his voice hoarse from the cold. Down below, a yellow glow flickered to life. Freja Berggren stepped into view at the base of the ladder, looking up at him without a trace of panic. She was wearing a simple cotton dress, her sleeves rolled up to her elbows, her face flushed with heat. 9 feet below the frozen surface of the Dakota Territory, inside a hidden 12 by 8-foot room lined with riverstone and packed clay, the temperature was holding steady at 62 degrees Fahrenheit. While neighbors across 3 counties were burning their dining chairs and watching their children shiver under 5 layers of wool, Freja had engineered a subterranean sanctuary that required almost no wood at all. Before we dive into the extraordinary science and secret history behind how a widowed mother accomplished what the most experienced builders on the frontier thought was impossible, take a second to hit that like button, subscribe to our channel, and drop a comment below telling us where you are watching from today and what is the coldest winter weather you have ever personally survived. We read every single comment, and your support allows us to keep bringing you these forgotten stories of human resilience. Now, to understand how Freja built a shelter that saved dozens of lives, when the worst blizzard in 40 years hit the plains? We have to go back 2 years before the storm, to a quiet autumn afternoon, when everyone in Ridgefield thought she had completely lost her mind. The story of the hidden shelter did not begin with a storm. It began with a grave. In the spring of 1883, Henrik Berggren was 34 years old, strong as an ox, and in the middle of breaking 16 acres of virgin sod when his appendix ruptured. In those days, on the isolated edge of the Dakota Territory, an internal infection was a death sentence. 2 days after the sharp pain began in his side, Henrik was dead, leaving his 31-year-old wife, Freja, alone on 52 acres of unbroken prairie. Freja was not a woman who panicked easily, but the math facing her in the autumn of 1885 was terrifying. She had 2 daughters, Signe, who was 10, and Elsa, who was 8. She had a single milk cow named Marin, 5 laying hens that were slowing down as the days grew shorter, and a sod house that her husband had built in a hurry during their first season on the claim. A sod house was cheap and easy to build, but it was a temporary shelter at best. The walls were made of stacked root-cut prairie sod, 2 feet thick, which provided decent insulation during mild weather. But by their 3rd year, sod walls began to settle, dry out, and crumble. Wind found every seam between the sod blocks. Rain turned the dirt ceiling into a dripping slurry of mud, and winter frost crept through the earth blocks like needles. Worse still was her financial situation. Freja owed $75 to the dry goods merchant in the nearby settlement of Ridgefield, a man named Bartholomew Vance. $75 in 1885 was a staggering sum for a widow with no cash crop. It represented nearly 2 years of average earnings for a farmhand. Bartholomew Vance was not the kind of creditor who offered charity. He was a shrewd, calculating businessman who had built his fortune by extending credit to struggling homesteaders during the summer months, waiting for them to fail when winter came, and then buying up their land patents at tax auctions for pennies on the dollar. He had already looked at Freja's 52 acres, located on a high ridge with good soil and access to a small creek, and decided it would make a fine addition to his growing cattle pasture. In September of 1885, as the first yellow leaves began to drop from the cottonwoods along the creek, Freja's nearest neighbor, Gunnar Thorne, rode over to her claim. Gunnar was a practical man who had weathered 15 Dakota winters, and he believed he was offering her sound, compassionate advice. He stood in her yard, holding his hat in his calloused hands, looking at the small sod cabin and the 2 young girls playing near the well. He told her plainly that she ought to pack her belongings, sell her cow, and take the train back to Minnesota where her sister lived. A woman alone with 2 young girls, he explained, could not cut enough firewood, repair a crumbling sod house, and survive a northern winter without a man to do the heavy labor. There was no shame in giving up a claim when nature and debt were stacked against you. Freja listened quietly, her arms crossed over her apron, her face unreadable. She thanked Gunnar for his concern and offered him a cup of coffee, but when he rode away, she did not start packing her trunks. She walked to the small wooden chest her father had given her when she left Norway, unlocked it with a brass key she wore around her neck, and pulled out a worn, leather-bound notebook filled with hand-drawn diagrams, mathematical calculations, and dense Norwegian script. Her father, Jens Lindegard, had been a master builder in the Gudbrandsdalen Valley of Norway for over 40 years. He was a man who understood wood, stone, and earth, not merely as building materials, but as living components of a natural world governed by unyielding laws of physics. Before his death, he had taught Freja things about heat, airflow, and soil thermodynamics that American homesteaders had never even considered. Freja sat at her kitchen table, looking at her father's drawings, and began to formulate a plan. She was not going to run away to Minnesota. She was not going to let Bartholomew Vance steal her land. And she was certainly not going to spend another winter shivering in a drafty sod house, watching her daughters cough from wood smoke while her meager food supplies froze solid on the shelves. She was going to build something the territory had never seen before, a structure hidden from sight, protected from the wind, and engineered to use the eternal warmth of the deep earth itself to keep her family alive. On a crisp, bright morning in late September, Freja hitched her cow Marin to the farm's light wooden sled, loaded 6 stoneware crocks of sweet butter she had spent 3 weeks churning, and made the 12-mile journey into Ridgefield. Ridgefield was a booming frontier town, built alongside the new railroad line. It boasted 2 saloons, a blacksmith shop, a grain elevator, and the massive 2-story frame building that housed Vance's general store and lumber yard. When Freja walked into the store, the air was thick with the smells of tobacco, salted pork, motor oil, and damp wool. A dozen local farmers and homesteaders were gathered around the potbelly stove in the center of the room, discussing the upcoming winter forecasts. The old-timers were predicting a brutal season. The fur on the prairie hares was already thick and white, and the geese were flying south in vast, panicked V formations weeks ahead of schedule. Freja walked up to the high wooden counter where Bartholomew Vance sat behind a thick ledger book. Vance was a portly man in his 50s, with thin graying hair, sharp blue eyes, and a habit of tapping his silver pocket watch against the wood whenever he was impatient. Freja placed her crocks of butter on the counter and presented her receipt. She asked Vance to credit $15 against her $75 debt, explaining that she intended to pay the rest after the fall harvest. Vance looked at the butter, made a note in his ledger, and then leaned across the counter, his smile thin and cold. He told her that $15 was a fine gesture, but butter would not pay for the winter supply she was going to need. He pointed out that her sod house was falling apart and that she had less than 2 cords of firewood stacked in her yard. He offered her a deal on the spot. If she signed over her land deed to him today, he would forgive her remaining $60 debt, give her $50 in cash, and pay for 3 tickets on the morning train to Street Paul. The men around the stove went quiet, listening to the interaction. It was an offer that many in the room thought she would be foolish to refuse. A widow alone on the prairie was a tragic sight, and Vance's offer seemed on the surface like an act of commercial mercy. Freja looked Vance straight in the eye and declined his offer. She told him her husband had shed his blood breaking that sod, and her daughters were going to grow up on their own land. Vance's smile vanished. His voice turned sharp, carrying across the silent store. He told her she was being foolishly stubborn. He reminded her that when November came, the prairie would freeze solid, and if she did not have proper shelter and 4 cords of hard wood, her children would be sleeping in an icebox. He declared that he would not extend her another penny of credit for lumber, glass, or nails. If her debt was not paid in full by the first day of May, he warned, he would have the territorial sheriff post a notice of foreclosure on her front door. Freja did not flinch. Instead of asking for credit for lumber or firewood, she pulled $5 silver from her apron pocket money she had saved by mending clothes for neighboring families and placed them on the counter. She told Vance she wanted to buy 3 specific items: a heavy, forged, steel trenching spade with an ash handle, a 4-inch hand-operated wood auger, and 6 8-foot 2x6 pine planks from his scrap pile. Vance stared at the coins, then at the widow, and burst out laughing. The men around the stove joined in, shaking their heads. Vance asked her what a widow was going to do with a trenching spade and heavy timber when she ought to be buying blankets and flour. He told her that if she thought she could dig her way out of a Dakota winter, she was even more confused than he thought. He sneered that a woman digging holes in the dirt was simply building her own grave before the frost hit. Freja picked up her receipt, gathered her new spade, auger, and timber, and carried them out to her sled without saying another word. She loaded the tools onto the wooden frame, adjusted Marin's harness, and turned her face back toward her claim. Let them laugh, she thought, as the cow's hooves crunched over the drying grass. Let them talk at the store. The cold was coming, and when it arrived, opinions and laughter would not keep anyone warm. Only physics mattered, and physics did not care about Bartholomew Vance. To understand what Freja was about to build, one must understand the man who had trained her. Jens Lindegard was not an educated academic, but he possessed an extraordinary, structured understanding of natural phenomena. In the steep, unforgiving fjords of central Norway, where timber was scarce and winter lasted 7 months of the year, survival depended on working with the earth rather than fighting against it. In his youth, Jens had served as an apprentice under Olav Gresseth, a legendary builder who constructed the deep earth cellars used by Norwegian mountain farmers for centuries. These were not simple, shallow pits dug into a hillside to keep potatoes from rotting. They were sophisticated, engineered subterranean living spaces built deep beneath traditional wooden storehouses. When Jens emigrated to America in 1871, he brought those ancient techniques with him, adapting them to the vast, treeless expanses of the Midwestern prairie. Shortly before his death, sensing that his daughter might one day face hardship on the frontier, he had spent 3 weeks walking her through the precise mathematical and structural principles of subterranean thermal control. He taught her that the surface of the Earth is a volatile, chaotic environment. The air above ground reacts instantly to wind, clouds, and seasonal shifts, swinging 80 or 90 degrees in a matter of hours. But as you dig downward into the soil, that volatility begins to dampen. At a depth of 3 feet, the Earth still feels the winter frost. At 5 feet, the soil freezes into a hard crust known as the frost line. But once a builder penetrates below 9 feet, something remarkable happens. The massive thermal inertia of the planet takes over. At that depth, the soil temperature disconnects almost entirely from the daily weather above. In northeastern Dakota Territory, no matter if the air at the surface was 90 degrees in July or 40 below zero in January, the subsoil, at 9 feet deep, maintained an unchanging baseline temperature between 42 and 48 degrees Fahrenheit. It was, as Jens had called it, an infinite ocean of heat. The challenge was not finding the warmth. The Earth provided that for free. The challenge was building a space that could extract that Earth heat without allowing moisture, stale air, or structural collapse to destroy it. Jens's blueprints laid out a precise method. First, the shelter had to be completely hidden beneath an existing surface building to protect its roof from direct rain, snow accumulation, and wind scouring. Second, the ceiling of the underground room needed a thick, multi-layer barrier wood, dry insulation, and tamped earth to prevent the cold surface frost from migrating downward. Third, the floor had to remain bare, packed clay, allowing the warmth from the deep planet to rise freely into the room. And finally, the space required an engineered ventilation loop that used wind pressure outside to continuously refresh the air without letting in cold drafts. Freja sat in her sod house, studying the faded brown paper drawings by the light of a lard lamp. She traced the lines her father's hand had drawn 5 years ago. Every measurement was clear. Every structural joint was calculated. She knew that if she followed these instructions to the letter, she would create a room that could hold 55 degrees in the dead of winter, using nothing more than the body heat of its occupants and a single small flame. On the first Monday of October, 1885, Freja began her labor. She waited until her daughters were asleep, lit a single tallow candle, and walked out to the woodshed behind the sod house. The woodshed was a modest structure, 8 feet wide and 12 feet long, built against the north wall of her house. It had a rough timber frame, plank siding, and a dirt floor littered with bark, sawdust, and stacked firewood. Because it sat on the north side of the main building, it was completely shaded from the road, making it the perfect location for secret work. Freja started by moving 2 cords of split cottonwood away from the back corner of the shed, stacking the logs neatly along the outer walls to create an interior screen that blocked the view from the shed's single doorway. Then, she marked out an 8 by 12-foot rectangle on the bare dirt floor using wooden pegs and string. She drove her new steel spade into the hard earth. The top 2 feet of soil was rich, dark prairie loam packed tight by decades of grass roots. It was exhausting work. Every spadeful had to be loosened, lifted into a wooden wheelbarrow, wheeled out through the back door of the woodshed, under the cover of darkness, and dumped along the southern foundation of the sod house. To any neighbor riding past during the day, the growing pile of dirt along her cabin's south wall looked entirely normal. It was standard prairie practice to bank earth against a sod house in the autumn to seal lower drafts. No one suspected that the dirt was coming from deep beneath her woodshed floor. After penetrating the topsoil, Freja hit the subsoil, a dense, yellow-gray clay mixed with small river gravel. It was as hard as unbaked brick. She had to use a pickaxe to break the clay into chunks before she could shovel it into the wheelbarrow. Her hands, despite thick wool gloves, developed deep, painful blisters that tore open and bled against the wooden spade handle. Her lower back burned with a constant, dull ache that made it difficult to stand up straight at the end of each night. Yet, she refused to stop. She calculated that she needed to move roughly 4.5 tons of earth to reach the required 9-foot depth. Working 4 hours every night after her daughters went to bed, she moved an average of 600 pounds of dirt per evening. By the 9th night, she was standing in a deep, rectangular pit that smelled of damp stone and ancient clay. The air at the bottom of the pit was noticeably different from the brisk autumn night air above. It felt still, heavy, and strangely mild. On the 12th day, she reached the 9-foot mark. She leveled the floor using a spirit level her husband had left behind, tamping the dense clay until it was as smooth and flat as a hardwood floor. She left the clay entirely bare. Next came the ceiling structure. Freja took the cow-drawn sled to the creek bed on Carl Lindquist's land, where deadfall cottonwood trees lay rotting in the brush. Over the course of 3 days, she cut and hauled 8 thick cottonwood logs, each 8 feet long and 7 inches in diameter. Working alone with a system of ropes, wooden levers, and skids she devised herself, she hauled the heavy logs into the woodshed and laid them horizontally across the top of the excavated pit. Setting their ends into deep notches, she had chopped into the firm subsoil walls. These logs formed the structural rafters of her underground ceiling. To seal the gaps between the logs, she used a traditional technique her father had called frost mortar. She took strips of coarse burlap sacking, soaked them in a bucket of water mixed with wood ash and clay, and stuffed them tightly into the seams between the cottonwood poles. As the autumn air cooled, the wet burlap froze solid, locking the timbers into a single, seamless wooden arch that could support thousands of pounds of weight. Over the timber ceiling, she spread a 12-inch layer of dry prairie grass and wheat straw she had gathered from her fields. Over the straw, she shoveled 18 inches of the excavated clay subsoil, tamping it down firmly until the floor of the woodshed above was restored to its original height. From the inside of the woodshed, the floor looked completely undisturbed. The dirt was level, covered in a fresh layer of wood chips and pine needles. Unless a person knew exactly where to look, there was no indication that an 8 by 12-foot room existed beneath their feet. With the main structural chamber completed, Freja turned her attention to the sophisticated environmental controls that would make the space livable. An underground room without ventilation is a death trap. Human respiration quickly depletes oxygen and creates a buildup of moisture that leads to deadly dampness and mold. Using the 4-inch wood auger she had bought from Vance, Freja bored a diagonal hole through the north clay wall of the chamber. The shaft ran upward at a precise 45-degree angle, traveling through 6 feet of solid earth before emerging outside the woodshed's exterior wall, just 4 inches above ground level. She lined the shaft with a hollowed-out elderberry branch, creating a smooth wooden pipe. She fitted the exterior opening with a downward-sloping wooden hood, angled away from the prevailing wind. This was the Venturi intake. When cold winter winds swept across the prairie, they created a low-pressure zone over the hooded exterior opening. This pressure differential acted like an invisible pump, continuously drawing stale air out of the subterranean chamber while pulling fresh, oxygen-rich air down through a secondary, smaller intake shaft she had bored near the trapdoor frame. Next came the most critical element of her father's design, the thermal mass wall, which Jens had called the flywheel. A room heated only by air cools down the moment the heat source goes out. But a room lined with high-density stone absorbs thermal energy when a fire is burning, stores that energy within its atomic structure, and then slowly radiates that heat back into the room over many hours. Over the course of 2 weeks, Freja made 5 trips to the creek bed, filling her wheelbarrow with smooth, heavy river granite stones. Each stone weighed between 10 and 25 pounds. She selected dark, fine-grained granite, which her father had noted held heat significantly longer than porous sandstone or soft limestone. She hauled 52 of these massive stones down into the chamber, one by one, Along the west clay wall, she stacked the stones in an interlocking, mortarless array, 4 feet high, 3 feet deep, and 6 feet long. The total mass of the stone wall was just over 950 pounds. To complete the space, she excavated a small secondary alcove off the east wall, a 4 by 6 foot nook with a low, arched doorway. In this alcove, she built a wooden roost and nesting box for her 5 laying hens. The addition of the chickens was a masterstroke of biological engineering. A single adult hen produces approximately 30 to 40 BTUs of metabolic heat per hour simply by living. 5 hens resting in a confined alcove would generate nearly 200 BTUs of continuous passive heat 24 hours a day, while also supplying her family with fresh eggs through the darkest months of the year. Finally, she crafted the entrance. She cut a 3-foot square opening in the timber ceiling near the north wall, framing it with the 2x6 pine planks she had purchased in town. She built a double-layered wooden trapdoor, lining the interior gap with dry straw for insulation. She attached 2 heavy harness leather hinges to the door and fitted the top surface with a recessed iron ring made from a bent barn nail. She built a sturdy, 4-rung ladder out of peeled birch saplings and set it beneath the hatch. Before closing the trapdoor for the first time, she moved her emergency supplies into the chamber. 40 pounds of dried navy beans, 30 pounds of coarse cornmeal, a 10-pound slab of salted bacon wrapped in waxed canvas, 12 glass jars of preserved prairie plums, a 5-gallon tin of lard, 4 wool blankets, a box of sulfur matches, 3 beeswax candles, and a small brass oil lantern with 2 pints of purified kerosene. She hung a simple glass mercury thermometer from a nail driven into the center cottonwood ceiling beam. When she stepped up the ladder, pulled the trapdoor shut behind her, and scattered a handful of dirt and wood chips over the wooden frame, the woodshed returned to total silence. The secret shelter was complete. It had cost her $5 silver, 3 weeks of relentless physical labor, and a dozen blistered fingers. Outside, the October wind was beginning to howl across the brown prairie grass, bringing the first smell of winter snow. Freja stood in her quiet woodshed, wiped the dirt from her apron, and smiled. Let the cold come. By late November 1885, the rumor mill in Ridgefield was operating at full capacity. Frontier communities are small, observant, and intensely suspicious of anything that deviates from established routine. Neighbors had noticed Freja's frequent trips to the creek bed. With her cow-drawn sled, they had seen her hauling heavy stones and mounds of yellow clay. They had observed that while every other farmer in the township was spending 8 hours a day in the woods cutting and splitting massive cords of timber, the widow Berggren seemed strangely unconcerned with her woodpile. She had barely 3 cords stacked against her shed, less than half of what a family needed to survive a standard Dakota winter. The general consensus in town was that grief had unhinged her mind. Carl Lindquist's wife, Anna, stopped by the claim one afternoon under the guise of bringing Freja a freshly baked loaf of rye bread. In reality, she had been sent by her husband to see if the widow was functioning rationally. Anna walked around the property, noting the cracked sod walls of the cabin and the modest wood stack. She gently suggested to Freja that she ought to consider selling her cows and moving into town before the real snow arrived. She warned her that once December hit, the roads would be blocked for months, and if her sod house collapsed or her fire went out, no one would be able to reach her in time. Freja accepted the bread with genuine gratitude, thanked Anna for her neighborly concern, but politely declined to leave. She assured Anna that she and her daughters had everything they needed and that God would provide for them. When Anna returned home and reported the conversation to her husband, Carl shook his head in pity. He told the local farmers at the Ridgefield grain elevator that the widow Berggren was living on faith and stubbornness, 2 things that had never once stopped a Dakota frost from killing a person. At Vance's store, Bartholomew Vance heard the reports with quiet satisfaction. He instructed his clerk to prepare the formal legal paperwork for a property foreclosure. In Vance's mind, the outcome was already determined. The widow would either freeze out by February and abandon the claim, or she would be forced to sell to him for pennies on the dollar when her debt came due in May. He even began offering her 52 acres to a wealthy land syndicate from Minneapolis that was looking to build a commercial grain storage facility near the rail line. Freja heard the whispers and saw the pitying looks whenever she went into town, but she remained completely silent. She knew that attempting to explain subsoil thermodynamics, Venturi airflow, or thermal flywheel storage to men who believed that survival was purely a matter of muscle and firewood would be an exercise in futility. They would not believe her until they saw it with their own eyes. The system faced its first true operational test in late November 1885, when an early Arctic cold snap swept down from western Canada. The weather dropped precipitously over a 6-hour period, falling from 32 degrees above zero at noon to 20 degrees below zero by midnight. A biting 20-mile-an-hour wind whipped across the prairie, searching out every crack and seam in the homesteads along the Popo-Aggie River basin. Inside Freja's sod cabin, the limitations of standard frontier housing became immediately apparent. Despite keeping a roaring fire in the small cast-iron cookstove, the room temperature 3 feet from the hearth dropped to 34 degrees. Frost began to form on the interior surface of the sod walls. The air was thick with stinging wood smoke as the shifting wind caused the stovepipe to backdraft. At 9 o'clock that evening, Freja made the decision. She told Signe and Elsa to put on their heavy wool stockings and coats. She lit her small brass oil lantern, carried it out to the woodshed, and opened the hidden trapdoor. The girls climbed down the birch ladder into the subterranean chamber. Elsa, the 8-year-old, hesitated at the top, frightened by the dark opening, but as soon as her feet touched the bare clay floor below, her fear vanished. The underground room was remarkably comfortable. Even before Freja lit the lantern, the ambient temperature inside the chamber was 46 degrees Fahrenheit, derived entirely from the stable baseline heat of the deep earth. Freja set the brass lantern on a flat stone at the base of the granite wall and adjusted the wick to a medium flame. She pulled the trapdoor shut above them, seating the wooden locking bar into its brackets. The effect was instantaneous. The deafening roar of the prairie wind, which had been rattling the boards of the sod cabin above, was instantly muted to a soft, distant hum. The air was completely still, completely dry, and entirely free of wood smoke. Freja checked the mercury thermometer hanging from the ceiling beam. Over the next 2 hours, as the oil lantern burned, the heat from the flame was absorbed by the air and drawn into the stacked river stones. The dark granite wall, which had been resting at 46 degrees, began to warm up to the touch. By 11 o'clock, the thermometer at chest height read 58 degrees Fahrenheit. Freja extinguished the lantern to conserve kerosene. For the rest of the night, the room remained illuminated only by the faint, warm glow of a single beeswax candle. The thermal flywheel effect took over. The 950 pounds of granite stones, having absorbed heat from the lantern, began to slowly radiate that stored thermal energy back into the small room. Combined with the metabolic heat of 3 human bodies and the 5 chickens roosting quietly in their alcove, the room temperature did not drop. At 6 o'clock the following morning, while the surface temperature outside was reading 22 degrees below zero and Gunnar Thorne was waking up to ice inside his blanket, the temperature inside Freja's subterranean chamber was 56 degrees. The girls slept peacefully on their straw mattresses for 9 straight hours. They woke up warm, rested, and in high spirits. Elsa played with her rag doll on the dry clay floor while Signe read aloud from her school primer. They stayed underground for 3 days until the cold snap passed. When Freja finally climbed the ladder, pushed open the trapdoor, and stepped out into the bright winter sunlight, she found her sod house frozen solid. The water in her kettle was a lump of ice, and the house walls were coated in white frost. But her children were completely healthy. Her fuel supply was 99% intact, and her hidden shelter had proven its design beyond a shadow of a doubt. If the winter of 1885 was a trial run, the winter of 1887 was an apocalypse. It began in November, with early, heavy snowfalls that covered the prairie grass before the range cattle could graze. Then, in December, a succession of Arctic high-pressure systems settled over the northern plains, locking the region in a deep freeze that lasted for over 2 months. It became known in the history books simply as the Hard Winter. By January 1887, the region was experiencing weather conditions that tested human endurance to its absolute limit. For 40 consecutive days, the thermometer in Ridgefield never rose above 0 degrees Fahrenheit. Range cattle, blinded by blowing snow and unable to break through the 2-foot crust of ice that covered the grass, died by the thousands. They drifted with the wind until they hit fence lines, where they piled up against the wire and froze to death standing upright. Across the territory, birds fell dead from the sky mid-flight, their tiny bodies frozen solid before they hit the ground. Native cottonwood trees along the river bottoms, filled with sap that expanded as it froze, ruptured with loud, booming cracks that sounded like cannon fire in the silent nights. In town and on the surrounding homesteads, the situation was turning desperate. The commercial coal supply shipped by the railroad ran out in mid-December, when snowdrifts blocked the tracks between Fargo and Bismarck. Families were forced to burn whatever they could find: corn cobs, wooden fences, old furniture, and green cottonwood logs that produced more moisture and smoke than actual heat. Standard housing across the region was failing at an alarming rate. Frame houses built with thin pine siding leaked heat so quickly that families had to keep their stoves red-hot 24 hours a day just to keep their living rooms at 35 degrees. This extreme, continuous firing created a new danger: chimney fires and structural stress. Flues cracked under the intense heat, setting fire to dry wooden roofs or filling homes with lethal carbon monoxide gas. On the 7th of January 1887, the weather forecast reached its absolute nadir. A massive Arctic bomb cyclone pushed down from the Northwest Territories, colliding with a moist air mass from the south. The barometric pressure dropped to historical lows. The station agent at the Ridgefield Railroad Depot watched his barometer needle plunge off the chart. The storm hit at midnight on January 8th. The wind rose to 50 miles an hour, driving fine, flour-like snow through the smallest cracks in every building. The ambient air temperature fell to 42 degrees below zero. It was not a storm to be endured. It was a storm to be survived. And across the township of Ridgefield, the fragile structures of human civilization were about to break. The great storm of January 1887 struck the township of Ridgefield like a physical blow. On the Thorne claim, Gunner Thorne woke at 2 o'clock in the morning on January 9th to the sound of splintering wood. The massive weight of accumulated snow on his woodshed roof, combined with 50-mile-an-hour wind gusts, had finally crushed the wooden rafters. The roof collapsed inward with a sickening crunch, burying his entire remaining supply of dry cordwood under 3 feet of icy debris. Gunner spent 2 frantic hours in the blinding storm trying to dig out enough wood to keep his kitchen stove going. By 4 in the morning, his fingers were dead to the touch, both of his big toes were snow-bitten, and the wood he managed to salvage was so soaked with melted snow that it choked his stove with thick, black smoke. By 6 in the morning, the temperature inside the Thorne cabin had dropped to 24 degrees Fahrenheit. His 8-year-old son was shivering uncontrollably, his lips turning blue. Gunner realized with a terrible, sickening clarity that if his family remained in their house through another night, they would not survive. In town, Bartholomew Vance was facing his own disaster. His grand, 2-story frame house, the pride of Ridgefield, was a triumph of modern Victorian appearance, but a total failure of thermal engineering. Built with large glass windows, high ceilings, and thin balloon frame walls, it required 3 large coal stoves running continuously to remain livable in winter. When the coal ran out, Vance had switched to cordwood, but the massive heat output needed to warm his high-ceiling parlor caused his brick chimney to overheat. At 3 o'clock on the afternoon of January 9th, the mortar joints inside his chimney wall failed. Toxic carbon monoxide and dense wood smoke poured through the floorboards into the upper bedrooms. Vance, his wife, and their 3 children were forced to flee into the street with only the clothes on their backs and a few wool horse blankets pulled from the stable. They took refuge in the back room of the general store, but the store's single potbelly stove was already struggling to keep the large, drafty room above 30 degrees. By the morning of January 10th, Vance's youngest daughter had developed a rattling, wet cough that filled her parents with dread. Gunnar Thorne knew he had only one chance. He remembered the guide rope he had seen at the Berggren place during the summer, and he remembered that Freja had somehow managed to stay warm during the cold snap of 1885 without ever buying wood from Vance. He wrapped his wife and children in every blanket they possessed, tied them together with a long length of clothesline so no one would be lost in the whiteout, and began the brutal, three-quarter-mile march through the blizzard toward Freja's claim. The journey took the Thorne family nearly an hour. The wind was so strong that it knocked 6-year-old Tommy Thorne off his feet 3 times, forcing Gunnar to carry the boy under his heavy coat. When they finally stumbled into Freja's yard, Gunnar was nearly blind from ice encrusting his eyelashes. He led his family directly to the woodshed, pushed open the heavy plank door, and pulled them inside out of the screaming wind. He didn't bother checking the sod house. He knew it would be empty. He went straight to the back corner of the shed, cleared away the wood chips, and pulled open the heavy trap door. The scene that met his eyes was something he would remember for the rest of his life. Down in the warm golden light of the subterranean chamber, Freja Berggren was sitting on a wooden bench, knitting a wool stocking. Sine and Elsa were sitting beside her on a straw mattress, playing a game of checkers using carved wooden buttons. The air in the room was completely still, completely dry, and wrapped around Gunnar's frozen face like a warm bath. The mercury thermometer on the central ceiling beam read 62 degrees Fahrenheit. Freja stood up immediately, without a word of surprise or hesitation. She helped Gunnar lower his exhausted wife and 4 shivering children down the birch ladder one by one. She wrapped them in dry wool blankets, sat them near the preheated riverstone wall, and handed each of them a tin cup of steaming broth made from dried beans and salt pork. As the word of survival at the Berggren claim spread through the strange, informal network of frontier communication, neighbors checking on neighbors during brief lulls in the wind, more desperate survivors began to arrive. At 3 o'clock that afternoon, Lars Krog, a bachelor farmer from 2 miles north, crawled through the woodshed door. He had lost his roof to the wind and was carrying a newborn calf wrapped inside his heavy canvas coat. Freja welcomed him without question and directed him to place the calf in the eastern alcove alongside her 5 hens. At 6 o'clock, the Miller family arrived 4 people who had abandoned their drafty frame house when their wood supply ran out entirely. And at 9 o'clock that evening, a knock came on the outer woodshed door. Gunnar Thorne climbed up to open it, expecting another local homesteader. Standing in the doorway, coated in ice, his face pale with cold and terror, was Bartholomew Vance. He was supporting his coughing daughter in his arms, his wife and 2 sons huddled behind him in the freezing shed. His fancy leather boots were ruined, his fur coat was soaked through, and his pride was completely gone. He looked at Gunnar, then down at the open trapdoor, and begged for shelter. Freja came up the ladder, looked at the man who had threatened to take her land and laughed at her spade, and simply said, "Bring the children down first." By midnight on January 10th, the 8 by 12-foot chamber and its small 4 by 6-foot alcove held 18 human beings, 5 laying hens, and 1 newborn calf. It was a crowd that would have produced suffocating heat and stale, unbreathable air in any ordinary room. But Freja's engineered shelter handled the load flawlessly. The 18 human bodies, each generating roughly 400 BTUs of metabolic heat per hour at rest, turned the room into a self-sustaining biological engine. Together with the animals, the occupants produced over 7,000 BTUs of heat per hour. The Venturi ventilation shafts worked perfectly. The steady wind outside pulled the stale air and excess moisture up through the 45-degree northern pipe, while pulling crisp, fresh oxygen down through the intake near the hatch. The air inside remained remarkably fresh, clean, and dry. The temperature inside the room held steady at 62 degrees Fahrenheit throughout the entire 60-hour ordeal, while outside, the prairie experienced the most lethal storm in its recorded history. Among the refugees sheltered in Freja's underground room was Silas Wright, the official station agent and weather recorder for the Northern Pacific Railroad at Grafton. Silas was a precise, methodical man who carried his official brass-cased mercury thermometer and leather-bound daily logbook everywhere he went. Recognizing that he was witnessing an extraordinary demonstration of practical engineering, Silas began recording formal, hourly scientific observations inside the chamber. For 48 hours, every 60 minutes, Silas recorded the interior temperature, the estimated exterior temperature, based on reports from arriving refugees, the condition of the air, the fuel consumption, and the physical health of the 18 occupants. On the morning of January 11th, while the storm still raged above, Silas sat on a wooden crate near the trapdoor ladder and opened his ledger to a blank page. He created a comparative data table, contrasting Freja's subterranean shelter with the conventional homes of the surrounding township. He wrote in neat, elegant script: thorn log cabin, wall construction, 10-inch single log, mud chinking. Heating source: cast iron wood stove. Average interior temp: 24 degrees Fahrenheit. Fuel consumed: 1.5 cords per week. Status: chimney cracked, abandoned due to extreme cold. Vance 2-story frame house. Wall construction: 2x4 stud framing. Pine siding. Heating source: 3 coal or wood stoves. Average interior temp: 18 degrees Fahrenheit. Fuel consumed: 200 pounds coal per day. Status: flue failure, toxic smoke, uninhabitable. Peterson Homestead. Wall construction: 4-inch frame structure. Heating source: small sheet metal heater. Average interior temp: 12 degrees Fahrenheit. Fuel consumed: all available wood exhausted. Status: evacuated. Berggren subterranean chamber. Wall construction: 9-foot subsoil clay, 1/4-inch straw and earth ceiling, 950 pounds granite stone mass. Heating source: subsoil baseline thermal mass, passive solar and lantern preheat, biological metabolic heat. Average interior temp: 2 degrees Fahrenheit. Fuel consumed: 0 cords wood, 0.5 pints lamp oil total. Status: 18 human occupants, 0 frostbite, 0 respiratory distress. Complete safety. Silas read the numbers aloud to the room. The contrast was so stark that it produced a profound, humbling silence among the gathered survivors. Bartholomew Vance sat on the bare clay floor in the corner of the room, his daughter sleeping soundly under a wool blanket beside him. His face was gray with shame. He looked at the dry, clean clay walls, at the simple granite stone array radiating steady warmth against his back, and at the widow he had publicly mocked as crazy 4 months ago. He stood up slowly, walked over to Freja, who was preparing a large pot of cornmeal mush over the small oil stove, and pulled his leather wallet from his coat pocket. He pulled out the formal $60 debt note she had signed, along with his handwritten foreclosure ledger. In front of Silas Wright, Gunnar Thorne, and the 15 other witnesses gathered in the warm earth room, Vance took the debt note, tore it into 4 pieces, and threw it onto the small flame of the oil stove. He turned to Freja, his voice trembling slightly, and told her that he was an ignorant man who had mistaken tradition for wisdom. He said her debt was cleared in full, and that as long as he lived, he would never doubt her word again. Gunnar Thorne looked at Silas Wright's ledger, then at Freja, and spoke for everyone in the township when he said, "We thought you were a widow wasting her time in the dirt, Freja. Turns out you were the only person in this county smart enough to build a home that actually works." When the great winter of 1887 finally broke in late March, the snow melted off the Dakota Prairie in a torrential, roaring thaw that filled the creeks and turned the dirt roads into impassable rivers of mud. On the first Saturday of April, the township of Ridgefield held its first public meeting at the local feed store. Nearly every family from 12 miles around attended. They came not to discuss crop prices or town politics, but to see Freja Berggren. Bartholomew Vance was the first to speak. Standing before the community, he officially presented Freja with a notarized document confirming that her 52-acre claim was paid in full and held clear title in her name forever. Furthermore, Vance announced that he was personally establishing a commercial building fund. He hired Freja on the spot as a master consultant, paying her an upfront fee of $200 more than enough to build a beautiful, permanent frame house for her family. if she chose to draw formal engineering blueprints of her father's subterranean shelter and supervise the construction of underground winter quarters on 8 neighboring ranches before the next autumn arrived. Over the next 2 years, the Berggren chamber became standard construction throughout northeastern Dakota. Farmers who had once laughed at the widow digging under her woodshed were now eager to spend their summer weeks excavating 9-foot pits beneath their own barns and outbuildings. The technique spread from township to township, carried by word of mouth and by Silas Wright's detailed news reports published in regional agricultural journals. The simple Scandinavian science of earth sheltering, thermal mass flywheel storage, and Venturi pressure ventilation saved hundreds of families during the subsequent severe winters of 1890 and 1893. Freja never built a fancy frame house in town. She stayed on her 52 acres, built a lovely, sturdy timber cabin directly above her subterranean shelter, and lived a long, prosperous life surrounded by a community that held her in deep, permanent reverence. Freja Berggren remained on her Dakota claim for the next 25 years, using the earnings from her consulting work and her farm to send both Sine and Elsa to college in Fargo. Her daughters grew up with a rare, quiet confidence, understanding that true security in an uncertain world comes not from expensive appearances or rigid traditions, but from understanding the laws of nature and having the courage to build accordingly. Station Agent Silas Wright's original weather journal, containing his meticulous 4-page comparative study of Freja's underground chamber during the storm of 1887, survived the passage of time and is preserved today in the permanent archives of the State Historical Society of North Dakota. The original site of her woodshed, located near what is now Grafton, North Dakota, remains listed as a state historical landmark, a lasting monument to the quiet brilliance of frontier innovation. Decades later, in the winter of 1942, Freja's youngest daughter Elsa would sit by a warm fireplace in her own home and retell the story of the hard winter of 1887 to her own grandchildren. She did not focus on the freezing storm, the fear, or the cruelty of Bartholomew Vance. Instead, she always ended her story with a single, vivid memory that had stayed with her for over 50 years. The image of a small brass oil lantern hanging from a cottonwood ceiling beam, 9 feet beneath the Dakota prairie. In an 8 by 12-foot room carved from the clay, 18 souls slept warm and safe while a killer blizzard destroyed the world above them, and the tiny yellow flame of the lantern never flickered once, because the earth, if you are wise enough to go deep enough, does not shake.